Okay, so maybe I will in fact start. So before I start, a small aside on non-degenerate forms and what it does for us. So here's my setup. Suppose V is a real vector space, and suppose I have a non-degenerate, let's say symmetric bilinear form on V. Say this is a non-degenerate symmetric bilinear form on V. So as we saw last time, giving such a form is equivalent to giving a vector space isomorphism between V and V star, V and its dual. So such a form defines an isomorphism where, so let's call this psi. It should, just to emphasize the role of the form, it's actually an isomorphism which depends on the form. So maybe sometimes we'll also write psi subscript the form. And the way it works is you just send every vector to the functional V dot, right? In other words, i.e., if you want to know what is psi of V evaluated on some vector W, then this is just, or maybe I'll call it V prime, is just the inner product or whatever, the form evaluated on the pair V prime. Right? So that's how you get this. And non-degeneracy of the form, so I mean you can do this for any bilinear form, but non-degeneracy of the form essentially says that this map is injective, and since you are in finite dimensional vector spaces, it means it's an isomorphism. So non-degeneracy is the same as saying psi is an isomorphism. Now, so when you have now an isomorphism between two vector spaces, you can do the following construction. Given any kind of structure on V, you can push it forward to V star under that isomorphism. Since V star is really just a copy of V, you can move any structure on V to V star. And so what does that mean? So there exists in fact a form which will have the exact same properties as V. So it will as the given form. So symmetric, bilinear, non-degenerate on V star. And how do you define this? Sort of by transport of structure, it's called. So in other words, if you are given two functionals f and g, so let's give that form, well we'll use the same notation for that form, but it's on V star. So when I plug in elements of V star, you'll know I'm talking about that form. So how does one do this? Given two functionals, how should one define their form? Well, transport of structure just means you figure out what vectors correspond to them under psi. So you compute psi inverse of f. So here's the definition. You compute psi inverse of f, psi inverse of g. They are both now vectors, and you calculate their form in V, right? So what you get is, so by this definition you have just transported the original form from V onto V star. Okay, so essentially V has a form and V star has a form. Now, so this is sort of one relation. So you should view this definition as saying that when I have two elements in V star, I can compute their form by staying inside V star. This is how I would compute. I mean, this notation here means I calculate their form. Maybe I will say subscript V star. So form on V star can be obtained by computing their form in V. But what is often used in this business is there is in fact a third representation of. So if you are attempting to find the inner product or whatever the form between f and g, there is a third way of computing it. This is by staying in V star, that's by staying in V, but there's a sort of a mixed representation, which is the following. You keep one of them intact, you keep f intact, you pull g back along psi, So one of them is now in V star, the other is in V, and you just calculate the pairing, meaning to say you evaluate f on psi inverse g. Okay, so this is just, remember from last time, this just means f evaluated on the vector psi inverse of g. Okay, so this is sort of a mixed representation. One of the fellows is in V star, the other is in V, right? And the proof is more or less just by, by this definition. So just leave the proof as exercise, just make a few noises about it. So if you sort of see what psi inverse of f comma psi inverse of g is, this is just, you're fixing the first component as psi inverse of f. So the functional that you get by fixing the first component as psi inverse of f is just the functional f itself, is psi of psi inverse of f, and therefore it's doing this is equivalent to evaluating f on the vector there. Okay. So I'm, like I said, leaving it as an exercise, but we'll sort of keep using this basic idea repeatedly in this business. Any questions on? Okay, so let us now head back to root systems. So I'm going to assume, so recall from last time that V ambient vector space R, so let me assume this is a root system. Let me say let so what we are now going to study is section configurations of pairs of roots. Okay, so let's look at what are all the possibilities between pairs of roots. So to do this, let's fix, so recall from last time, root system is a finite set which has got reflections. About each alpha you've got a reflection which preserves the entire root system, and then there was an integrality condition. So the key thing that we observed was we can actually construct a form on V. So let this form be in fact a positive definite symmetric bilinear positive definite most importantly WR invariant form we showed existence in two ways, one abstractly by the averaging trick and another explicitly by writing out a nice formula for this form, the verification of which was an exercise. Okay, so we can choose such a form, and the point of this choice was really to simplify alpha check. Okay, so by doing this we observed what does this form do for us. Well, as always, it sets up an isomorphism between V and V star, and under this isomorphism this mysterious object alpha check becomes, well, just some multiple of alpha, and the multiple turned out to be 2 over alpha alpha. Okay, so the inverse image of alpha check under psi turned out to be this object, right? So like we saw in that example, everything was just, the hyperplanes, once you thought of them in this way, were just multiples of the original roots themselves. Okay, so that's exactly what that's going to be the setup. And recall that so here's a definition. So given two roots alpha beta in R, let's define this number n alpha beta, which is going to be okay, there are several conventions. Well, there are two possible conventions for this. This is the Bourbaki convention. N of alpha beta is alpha beta check rather than beta alpha check. So this again means you are pairing the functional beta check with the vector alpha, and recall by the axiom 3 of root system that this must actually be an integer. So in fact this number is an integer for every pair of roots, and by what I've just said regarding bilinear forms and stuff like that, this mixed representation, when you want to evaluate the functional beta check on alpha, you could attempt to doing that computation purely in V star or purely in V. Okay, so let's do it in V. So which means I must change f to its inverse image under psi. So in this case it means instead of beta check, I should replace it by its inverse image under psi, which we just said is 2 beta over beta beta. Okay, so I have now converted this functional back into a vector using psi inverse, and then I just compute the inner product of that with alpha and do this computation in V. Okay, so this is now just pure formal consequences of what we have there, and so you can rewrite this as 2 alpha beta over beta beta. Okay, so this is an equivalent definition for n alpha beta. It's just the number 2 times the inner product of alpha beta over beta beta, where the inner product is whatever any chosen symmetric bilinear positive definite form. And it doesn't matter which form you choose, you always get the same numbers. Okay, so that's this guy, and observe it's an integer. So let's prove some basic properties, lemma or observation about these numbers. So what's n alpha alpha? So what's n alpha alpha? It's 2. If you sort of use this definition, it's clear, right? Okay, now sort of the next key point, what are these numbers good for, or what explains most of the importance is they appear in the formula for the reflection. So recall that if say you were attempting to do so alpha and beta are roots again. So suppose I wanted to compute the reflection S beta of alpha, and recall from last time I said I will sort of be lazy and suppress the beta check which appeared in the notation for the reflection, right, because it's more or less understood. So here by S beta I mean S beta beta check. So when it acts on alpha, by the definition it was alpha minus beta check alpha times beta. So notice again I am just freely swapping the variables in the pairing. Right? Sometimes I'll write the vector first and the functional next and so on. So here this is just beta check evaluated at alpha times beta, right? That was the formula for the reflection with vector beta. And notice that this number here is precisely what we are calling n alpha beta. Sometimes you'll also see this formula written out like this. Okay, so these numbers you should think of as being the things which appear in the formula for the reflection. So in particular it says when you reflect a root alpha about another root beta, what you get is alpha plus some integer multiple of beta. Okay, so those are those numbers, and so this particular observation will be very key, that every time you know something about the n's, it tells you something about the reflections and vice versa. And fact 3 is, I guess there are 2 of them, 3a, which tells you something about, so here for this I will assume if alpha beta is not 0, in other words if n alpha beta is not 0, right. So observe the denominator was never 0, right, it was, I guess I left it as an exercise, that beta beta, the norm is never, well I guess in this case it's easy, right, it's just a positive definite form. So since I am dealing with non-zero vectors, I am guaranteed that denominator is not 0. Now the numerator alpha beta, if it's not 0, then n alpha beta and n beta alpha are both non-zero integers, and one can compute their ratio Okay, so just simple observation about what the ratio of these numbers will be. The numerator will be the same whether I write it as alpha beta or beta alpha. The inner product is symmetric, so it's the same. So all I'll get is the ratio between the norms. That's a beta beta and this is an alpha alpha. Right. So this is norm of alpha square. So if you wish, this is norm of alpha square. This is norm of beta square. Squares of the lengths. And so this is their ratio, and if you compute their product, so if you compute their product, then here's what you get. It becomes, so there's no cancellation anymore. It's 4 times alpha beta square over norm alpha square norm beta square. So I can write it as 4 times the inner product of alpha beta square over this, but the inner product of alpha beta can be written as the length of alpha, length of beta times cosine of theta, where theta is the angle between them, right? And so the length factors still cancel. So if I now think of alpha and beta as vectors in this Euclidean space which makes some angle theta, then this final outcome of this is just 4 times cosine square theta. Okay, so these are the main facts about these numbers n's. Their ratio gives you the ratio between the norms of the roots, and their product tells you something about the angle between the roots. And of course, it means that now the last condition says that you are trying to multiply 2 integers and the result must equal 4 times cosine square theta, right? So the product of 2 integers must be, so what's the conclusion here? The product of these 2 integers can therefore only be one of these following possibilities, because 4 cosine square theta is a number between 0 and 4 and it must be an integer, right? So that gives you a fairly restrictive set of choices for these numbers. And so let's just write all the possibilities out. So here are the various possibilities for these numbers. So sort of make a table: n alpha beta, n beta alpha, and of course, automatically knowing these 2 numbers tells you something about their product and quotient. So in other words, one also knows something about, so once I know the first 2 entries of this table, I can compute the ratio between the roots and I can compute the angle between the roots. Okay, so maybe that's the table. And so let's just write out all the possibilities. So their product, if their product is 0, then it means that one of them is 0, right? So the first possibility is one of these 2 numbers is a 0, but observe n alpha beta is a 0 means that this numerator is a 0, right? And so alpha beta must be 0. The inner product between the roots must be 0, and therefore you would get 0 even if you computed n beta alpha. Right, so the only way the product can work out to be 0 is if both numbers are 0. And notice in this case the ratio thing assumed expressly that alpha beta is not 0. So this this is undefined. We can't say anything about it. But the angle, of course, if the inner product between the 2 roots is 0, then it means they are at 90 degrees to each other. Right. So the angle can be concluded in this case, so that we have both zeros. Now similarly again, if the product works out to be 1, then the only possibilities are these. The only way you can get 1. And now in this case, let's use the quotient. It says that the ratio between these numbers is the square of the ratio of the norms. So here norm beta or norm alpha has to be 1, the same here, and the angle is what? The angle is not 0. So let's try and compute. So what does it say? It says cosine square theta is the product divided by 4, right? So to find the angle, we need to use maybe I'll leave this space for the remaining entries of the table. Okay, so the angle computation. Cosine square of theta must be the product of these numbers over 4. So now the case we are considering, the product of the integers is 1. So it's 1 over 4, which means cos square theta is 1/4. So we are looking at plus or minus half, right? So plus half would correspond to an angle of 60 degrees, and minus half would correspond to 120 degrees. Now, how does one determine whether it's plus or minus? So what, for example, what do I need to put in here? If n alpha beta is a plus 1, then is this angle 60 or 120? Why? Okay, both are positive, which means that, so for example, n alpha beta is positive, says that, if you look at this expression, it says that alpha beta is positive, right? Because the denominator is always a positive quantity. So if n alpha beta is positive, then the angle between alpha and beta is acute, because their inner product is a positive number. So therefore, in this case, since this guy is positive, we must be looking at an acute angle. And in this case, since the n alpha beta is negative, we are looking at the obtuse angle, which in this case is 120. Okay. Now I'll sort of just write the remaining entries out and sort of just let you check them. So n alpha beta theta. So again, now we want possibilities where the product is 2. So one of them is a 1, 2, minus 1, minus 2, right? And I should also look at the case where this guy is a 2 and that guy is a 1. Okay. So, but anyway, let's do these first. So if it's 1 and 2, then the ratio of the norms, I should get this right. So if it's 1 and 2, the ratio of the norms turns out to be, let's see, if I n alpha beta over beta alpha. So alpha beta over beta alpha is half, but that computes alpha square over beta square, right? So in fact, it's 1 by square root 2 is the reciprocal of this guy. So I got this right. Okay, and so here again it's the same thing. The angle is what changes. Now if you do the same computation, you'll now get cos theta equals 2 over 4. Cos square theta is 2 over 4, or cos theta is 1 over root 2. So we are looking at either 45 degrees or 135 degree angle. And the first one happens when this is positive, and the second when it's negative. Okay, and now like I said, I should also swap. I should also take the case when this guy is 2 and that guy is 1, but then you can see, it's just interchanging alpha and beta. So then this would become 1 over root 2. That's the only thing that will happen. So I'm going to neglect that case. Now let me look at the case when their product is 3. It's 1, 3, minus 1, minus 3. And again here it turns out to be root 3. Now the angle is either a 30 degree angle or a 150 degree angle. And the last case, when it can actually be 4, Now if it's a 4, then we are either looking at 2, 2, minus 2, minus 2. And in this case, the angle turns out to be, so firstly the ratio of the norms is now 1. Okay, and okay, so let's see what are the angles. Well, it turns out to be either 0 or pi. Okay, so the product is 4, but again this is sort of the uninteresting case, because so what is this, this row of the table tell us? It says that beta and alpha have the same length and they make an angle 0, which means beta is the same as alpha, right? So this is just looking at the case where beta equals alpha, and the bottom row is now the case where beta equals minus alpha. So of course those are also possible configurations of two roots, and the last two entries again are n alpha. So remember, the product being 4 is what I am considering now, alpha beta, beta alpha. So there is another possibility, one of them could be 1, the other could be 4, and if you do this, you will see that it's 2 and the angle is 0. Similarly, those are the very last two entries of the table, and again the angle being 0 means that beta must be along the same direction as alpha but twice as long. So therefore this just means beta is 2 alpha, this means beta is minus 2 alpha. Okay, and again, like I said, I'm not writing the other possibility out where you can swap alpha and beta. Okay, so modulo swapping alpha and beta, this table completely lists out all possible configurations of pairs of roots, okay, inside V. These are the only possible angles they can make between each other, and these are the only possible, and when they make specific angles, those are the specific ratios of root lengths that can occur. Okay, so all this restrictive, it's a very finite set of configurations, and this really came about because of the integrality condition, because we assumed that these numbers n alpha betas were integers. Okay, any questions so far on? Okay, now these final two, well, I guess maybe even the final 4. So of course beta being equal to alpha is not very interesting. Suppose I take two distinct roots and I ask for all configurations of distinct roots, then I can safely ignore these two rows. But what you get here, it says that if alpha is a root, then it could happen that beta could be 2 alpha. So this is a possible configuration of a pair of roots, and we've already seen an example where it occurs, right? What's a root system where you have this? BC1, right? In rank 1, we had the root system where one of the roots was alpha and the other was in fact twice that. So just from this analysis, we do see that that configuration is allowed, but we will, for the purposes of considering Lie algebra, so remember all, there are sort of two aspects. One is this abstract study of root systems, but eventually we want to use all this to get an understanding of Lie algebras, and it turns out that if you are really looking at root systems which arise from Lie algebras, then you don't need to worry about, this scenario. Okay, so such configurations never occur if your root system arises from a Lie algebra. So sort of take that on faith for now. So let me just define what, we'll just give these guys a name. You call a root system reduced. So as opposed to, remember the earlier word was irreducible. Okay, so we call it reduced if this configuration never happens. If alpha and 2 alpha are okay, there's always so how exactly should I write this? Okay, if for all alpha in R, for every root, the span of alpha intersected with the root system only gives you alpha and its negative. Just a very fancy way of saying both alpha and 2 alpha can't be roots. Okay, so we are really, for the rest of, well, I guess, I'm sorry, what? Well, R alpha is just a span of alpha. Remember, the underlying base field is a real numbers. So by this I just mean take the one-dimensional span of alpha, and you see in that one-dimensional span which other roots occur. And what I'm saying here is you shouldn't get any roots other than alpha and minus alpha itself, which of course you will get, but you shouldn't get 2 alpha. That's the point. Okay, so for I guess the remainder of the school, we can as well, you know, we'll always work with this assumption that the root systems that we get are reduced, and possibly something about non-reduced root systems on the tutorial sheet. Okay, so now just a quick corollary to the data which appears in this table. So one of the key things to note in this table is that the number 1 always occurs in every row in some sense. Well, in almost every row. So if for a moment, let's not worry about the case of alpha and beta being sort of negatives or equal to each other, and not worry about the case of so if I'm in a reduced root system, then I'm only, and if alpha and beta are distinct or linearly independent, I'm only looking at the first few rows of this table. And you'll notice that 1 occurs in this table except when n alpha beta is 0. So in every row, you'll see either a 1 or a minus 1 occurs amongst these 2 numbers. Okay? Because if a product of 2 numbers should equal 0, 1, 2 or 3, then one of the numbers must be a 1. That's basically all that's happening, right? So there's always a 1 or a minus 1 which occurs in every single row of the table. So that's because sort of the law of small numbers, there aren't too many ways of multiplying small numbers out to get other small numbers. Now the corollary of this is the following. If it's true that n alpha beta is 0 for roots alpha and beta, then says that alpha minus beta must be a root. Okay, so here I'm assuming alpha beta roots again. And corollary 2 to the data in the table is that if n alpha beta is negative, then alpha plus beta is a root. Okay. So let's just prove one of them, the other will be more or less the same. So if n alpha beta is positive, then we want to claim that alpha minus beta is a root. So let's just scan through the table and figure out where can n alpha beta be positive. So we are either looking at the second row or the fourth row or the sixth row of the table. Right? We are just looking at these 3 possible configurations of roots. Now in each of these cases, observe, like I just said, that 1 must therefore occur. Right? Observe, if n alpha beta is positive, then either n alpha beta or n beta alpha is a 1. One of them is a 1. So and remember here again, like I said, I didn't really write the other swap. There should be a 2, 1 also in this table. So all I can say is one of them is a 1. So proof in case 1, observe either this or that is a 1. And conveniently we have what we want on the board already. Now observe, as we said, these numbers are important because they occur in the formula for reflections. So for instance, if n alpha beta is 1, right, then we'll just plug that in here. Let's compute the reflection as beta of alpha, and you get alpha minus 1 times beta, right? So if n alpha beta is 1, observe that S beta of alpha is alpha minus beta, and alpha is a root, S beta is a reflection. When you perform a reflection on a root, axiom 2 of the root system said the answer must be a root. Right? So therefore, if n alpha beta is 1, this reflection S beta of alpha would give you alpha minus beta, which would make it a root. If n beta is, if n beta alpha is 1, you will just have to interchange the role of alpha and beta. You will have to compute S alpha of beta, and then that will give you beta minus alpha as a root. Right? So if n beta alpha is 1, then you sort of compute the other reflection, S alpha of beta, which will turn out to be beta minus alpha, which is a root. But why does that imply alpha minus beta is a root? Negative of a root is always a root, right? For instance, when you perform, if gamma is a root, you compute S gamma of gamma, it gives you minus gamma. Right? So if something is a root, its negative is always a root. Right? That's one of the things that's already come up. So this guy is a root, which implies its negative is a root. So you're done. And the proof of the other thing is similar. There you will say that at least one of these two numbers is a minus 1. Okay, so I'll leave that for now. So these numbers are often called Cartan integers. These n alpha betas are often called the Cartan integers. Okay, so let's see. So since we have sort of looked at all possible configurations of pairs of roots, we are sort of in shape to give more examples, or well, at least add to the list from last time. So last time I sort of said, can we construct examples of rank 2 root systems, and I constructed one of them, right, which was A2, right, the configuration where everything made a 60-degree angle with everything else. Right? So now, let's look at one further example. So if you are attempting to find the rank 2 root system, so I have a root alpha, and let's say I have another root beta. For now, of course, there are several other roots typically. Now, this configuration between pairs of roots says that the angle between alpha and beta can only be one of finitely many choices. It can be 60 degrees. Well, let's start from the bottom. It can be 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, 120 degrees, 150 degrees, right? Sort of goes in multiples of 30. So those are the only possibilities. And the diagram we drew last time, the root system A2, is a case where every one of these angles is a 60 degrees. So this was the A2 root system from last time, and it's more than just the angle often tells you what the root lengths ratio is. So if the angle is a 60 degrees or a 120 degrees, the two roots must have the same length, right? That's also a rigidity condition forced on us. So remember in this case that we assumed that every one of these roots was of length 1, and that's in fact forced by these, this table. It says if whatever be the length of alpha, somebody who makes a 60-degree angle with alpha must have the same length. So that thereby it forces everybody here to have the same length. Now, maybe I'll give you one further example. It's called B2, which is, so I have say alpha, and now let me choose one of the other angles, right? So I had a 30, let's choose say 45 degrees. So suppose we have a root beta which makes a 45-degree angle with alpha. Right? So, and we want to construct a root system which has alpha and beta in it, and see what else we need to throw in. So what should the ratio of the root lengths be? Root 2, right? So in other words, say let me assume beta is longer than alpha. So root 2 just means, so if say alpha has has length 1. So let me think about drawing this right angle triangle here, where these two sides have the same length. Now beta is the hypotenuse, right? So that's a 45-degree angle. Now let's construct something in which all the angles are 45, just like here all the angles were 60. Let's construct something where all the angles are 45. So here if this is pi over 4, so then I'm looking for something along this direction, along this direction, along this direction, and along the diagonals. So that would be, so now I still have to tell you what the roots are, but these are the directions in which I'm going to try and find my roots. So let's say I have alpha here, beta along the 45-degree line, and I want something along the 90-degree line, right? So let's call it a gamma for now. So if gamma is the third root, its angle with beta is 45, right? So how big should it be? Yeah? Right, it could be root 2 times this, right? Or it could be 1 by root 2 times that, because remember there's still one, the swap is missing in the table. I could think of beta as being longer than gamma, for instance. So here is, so let me just tell you what the root system is. So you sort of look at the guy whose length is 1 now. If alpha has length 1, along the y-axis you pick things of length 1, and along these diagonals you pick the things of root 2, length root 2. So it's sort of like you complete that square, and you just pick the roots as the vertices of the square and the midpoints of the sides. Okay, and now you must check that it does satisfy the axioms of the root system. Okay. So well, let's see. So it's basically these points which I marked here, the endpoints of these arrows. Okay, so this guy has 4 plus 4, 8 roots. This is called the B2 root system. And notice that it does, satisfy the constraints that come from the table, at least, that for every pair of roots whose angle is of 45 degrees, the ratio between the root lengths is root 2 or 1 over root 2. Okay, so that's the second example. And then the other example, so there's a guy called G2, which would now correspond to a 30-degree angle. Just like here we had everything is a 45-degree angle. So we are done with the 45-degree angle, the 60-degree angle. G2 is the fellow where everything makes a 30-degree angle with its neighbor. And there, of course, the ratio of the root lengths will now have to be root 3. Okay, so I will sort of leave the construction of G2 as an exercise. Probably put it on the tutorial sheet. Okay, so in some sense, this table already tells us, gives us a lot of information to try and construct all the various rank 2 root systems. Okay, so now I sort of want to move on to talk about some very important notions. So two of these, of course, I will define what chambers are and what basis is. So sometimes this is also called a base, or it's called a base sometimes rather than a basis, to avoid confusion with the basis of vector space. So I would say sometimes you also see, for example, in Humphreys, I think it's also called a base instead of a basis. And WR, of course, we already know, but they're sort of all three very closely linked to each other. A lot of this is really about the action of the Weyl group and trying to understand the action of the Weyl group on the vector space V, and trying to get a handle on that, and one is naturally led to these notions. And it will turn out that these things are also indispensable from the point of view of classification of root systems. So let's just define all these notions. It will turn out to be all more or less natural. So definition, again, I'm going to assume that R is a reduced root system. So let VR be a reduced root system, which means that 2 alpha is not a root if alpha is 1. And observe again, as we know, so corresponding to each root alpha, we know that there is a hyperplane, right? The hyperplane which is about which you are performing the reflection. So in some sense, each root comes with a hyperplane attached. So let H denote the set of hyperplanes. Let this be the set of hyperplanes H alpha. So let me call the hyperplane H alpha. Remember, this is nothing but the kernel of the functional alpha check, as alpha ranges over all the roots. Okay, so given a root system, one is now going to collect all the hyperplanes. So for instance, if one were talking about the A2 root system, it's probably is there color chalk by any chance? Pendra, is there color chalk anywhere by any chance? No, don't worry if it's. No, I'm just wondering if I'm. Take it. Okay. Just here? Wonderful. That's all. Great. Thank you. Okay, so just so as not to confuse the roots with the hyperplanes themselves, so let's just draw this. The A2 root system consists of these 6 guys, and the hyperplanes are, well, in this case they are just lines. So for instance, this is a hyperplane which is perpendicular to this root, right? So maybe we shouldn't know. It's the same hyperplane perpendicular to both the root and its negative. So this is orthogonal to the root along the x-axis. Now the next root here, orthogonal to it would be something which bisects these roots, and the third fellow which is orthogonal to the remaining root would bisect those are the hyperplanes. So that's the A2 root system in which I have drawn the 3 hyperplanes. Okay, so the first observation to make is the following, that the action of the Y group, so the very first observation as soon as we define. So remember the Y group, so let's, I'm just going to draw the W of R, start calling it W. So the Y group, remember W of course preserves the root system itself, right? The various roots are, if you act W on a root, the result is a root by whatever axiom 2. But in fact the same is true for the hyperplanes. So W preserves a set of hyperplanes. It's not just the roots, but if you take a hyperplane and act the Y group on it, what you will get will be a different hyperplane corresponding to a different. No, I'll say it again. Sort of all these functions where they already get the award before the photographer. Then we do it all over again. Okay, so the point being that if you take a hyperplane perpendicular to alpha or corresponding to alpha and you act while group element on it, what you will get will be the hyperplane which corresponds to the root W alpha. Okay, so that's all. That's the end of the proof. And sort of another little point here to note. So observe that the hyperplane H alpha, right, the kernel of alpha check. So remember H alpha. So I should just say also note or recall that the hyperplane H alpha, which is nothing but all elements which are killed by alpha check, you can rewrite it in terms of that form. Since we have this form on V, you can also think of this as just being all elements of V such that X is orthogonal to alpha. Okay, so once you put that form on the vector space, you can alternately think of this hyperplane as just being all elements which are orthogonal to alpha. And the reason again is that thing that I started today's lecture with, right? So you either you look at alpha check paired with X, that's equivalent to computing it in terms of the form. You can rewrite it as X inner product with whatever alpha check corresponds to under that isomorphism, and alpha check corresponds to 2 alpha or alpha alpha. Okay, so if alpha check kills a vector, that's equivalent to saying that the inner product of X with 2 alpha or alpha alpha is 0. That's the same as saying inner product of X with alpha is 0. Okay, so now the whole point here, and something which I've used implicitly here, is if the ambient vector space V has got this nice inner product, something which is WR invariant, then everything is just a nice geometric thing. The hyperplane H alpha is just the perpendicular hyperplane to alpha, where the perpendicular now is with respect to this form. Okay, so this basically the proof, and again I will sort of just leave checking this as an exercise. Okay, so the first fact is that the while group actually preserves the hyperplanes, but let's sort of just see it by example. The while group is supposed to be reflection about each of these is generated by the reflections about these 3 hyperplanes. That's the definition of the while group in this case. And of course, when you take, say, this y-axis hyperplane, you reflect all the roots, of course, go to themselves. That's something we checked last time. But let's see that the hyperplanes also go to themselves. So if you take the y-axis, you reflect this hyperplane here, which goes through the first and third quadrants. Of course, it becomes the other hyperplane, the one which passes through the second and fourth quadrants, right? And the y-axis itself is left fixed. So the while group in fact permutes the set of hyperplanes, and of course it also permutes a set of roots, as I just said. Since it permutes the hyperplanes, it also leaves their complement invariant. So here's a definition. Call it Vreg, or the regular elements of V is just defined to be things which don't belong to any of the hyperplanes. So it has V minus the union of the hyperplanes. H alpha, or let's say H belongs to script H. So you just look at all vectors which do not lie on any of the hyperplanes, so it's just sort of all those interior regions. So in this case, there are actually 6 distinct regions that you can see which lie in Vreg. For instance, let's see, this is one of them. Right, it's bounded by these 2 pieces, but everything inside is part of Vreg. Similarly, everything here is part of Vreg, and so on. Right, and so on. So I sort of have 6 such regions. So there are 6 regions in the plane which are not on any of the hyperplanes, and the connected components, right? So they naturally split into 6 pieces here. So these connected components are called the chambers. Okay, you can either call them the chambers for the root system, or the chambers for the action of the while group, or the chambers of the while group, and so on. These are the chambers of the root system. So by what we just said, since the while group preserves the hyperplanes themselves, it also preserves their complement, the complement of that union. So observe the while group. Okay, let's write W of Vreg. Vreg for all W in the while group. Okay, so acting any element of the while group will map one chamber, elements of one chamber to another. Well, will map elements of Vreg to themselves, but W is just a linear isomorphism, right? It's just an invertible linear map. So it's a homeomorphism of the underlying topological space, and so the connected components will just map to connected components. So here and further. W is, it's an invertible linear transformation, so you should really think of it as a homeomorphism of Vreg to itself, and so W maps, the set of chambers is fixed under the action of W. So if you look at the set of chambers, this is then permuted by W. When a while group element acts on a chamber, what you get is another chamber, right? Again, let's check it by example. Sort of reflect chamber 1 about that, then of course what you would get would be chamber 4, right? So chamber 1 about reflection about this hyperplane will give you chamber 4. If you go about the y-axis, you will get chamber 2. There's one more possibility, right? There's the other hyperplane which will map 1 to 6. Right? So chambers will have to map to chambers. Okay, so W acts on the set of chambers. Okay, so that's I guess the first thing. So the next section is, let me now go back to roots, start talking about positive and negative roots. Okay, so now we are starting to talk about the things which bisect these. I mean, the things we started out with in the first place, which are these 6 arrows in the middle. Maybe we should put them in. So these are the roots in this case. Okay, now we want to categorize these roots into positive and negative roots. Now, so we want to split them into 2 pieces. Now, how does one do this? Well, that's where this Vreg plays a role. Suppose you pick a regular element of the vector space, then this element can be used to split the roots into 2 pieces. So I'll call these the positive roots and the negative roots determined by x. And how do you define these? Well, what does it mean for an element to be regular? What can I say about the inner product of regular root with of a regular vector with any root, non-zero, right? A regular element by definition does not lie on any of the hyperplanes. In other words, its inner product with alpha has to be a non-zero real number for all roots, right? And non-zero is exactly what I want, because now I can split things into two pieces, those roots for which this is positive and those roots for which this is negative. So this is all alpha in R for which alpha x is positive. This is now going to be all roots. For which alpha x is negative. Okay. So, and of course, what the first thing says is R, the original root system, is just a union of these two pieces. There can't be anything else. And in fact, further, since we know that if alpha is the root, then minus alpha is the root, it also further says that if alpha belongs to R plus, minus alpha belongs to R minus, right, because of the way the inner product works. So also R minus is in fact nothing but negative of things in R plus. Okay. So this is the splitting which is affected by the choice of a regular element. Okay, but regular elements sort of come in 6 flavors. They are in various chambers, and so the question is this: if I, there are only finitely many ways of splitting the set of roots into two pieces, right, of equal cardinality. So even though there are infinitely many regular elements here, it's not going to be the case that each of them would give you a completely different split. There are only finitely many splits. But more interestingly, if you pick a regular element anywhere, for example, something in the first chamber, then you can ask the following question, and I pick maybe another regular element somewhere, could be in the same chamber or in a different chamber, and now I ask, there is a split which is defined by x of the roots into two pieces, y splits the roots into two pieces, right? Would these two things be the same, right? So here's sort of the natural question one would want to ask: if you pick two regular elements, then when is it the case that the split into positives and negatives? So once the positives match, the negatives will automatically have to match, because they are just because of this property. So the question is, when is the split identical? For what choices of x and y are these identical? And sort of rather sort of beautiful and nice answer is if and only if they belong to the same chamber. So you can sort of pick your x and you let it vary in the same chamber, right? You sort of allow it to run over this chamber, and that will not affect the split. It will always split into the same positives and negatives as long as x runs here. As soon as it crosses a hyperplane, the way it splits the roots into plus and minus changes. Okay, and it's in fact an if and only if statement, but let's sort of prove the more illuminating direction, and I'll sort of leave the other way around. Okay, which means that I want to show that if x and y are in the same chamber, then the split is the same. Is that what I want to do? Right, okay. Okay, right, that's what I want to, I guess. So if they are in the same chamber, I want to show that the pluses and minuses are the same. So suppose not. So if not, I mean if not of what you want to show, so let's say if r plus of x turns out not to be the same as r plus of y, then what does it mean? It says that there is a root which is positive with respect to x but negative with respect to y. So this means that there exists a root alpha in R such that inner product with x is positive, inner product with y is negative. Right? So that's what it means. Now what does that tell us? It tells us that if you sort of imagine this here as your vector space and consider the hyperplane H alpha, right? This is the set of vectors which are perpendicular to alpha. Now it says that x and y lie on the two sides of this hyperplane. They lie on the different half spaces, right? Because x is positive inner product with alpha and y is negative inner product with alpha. Now, once you have a hyperplane splitting these two things, they can't be in the same chamber anymore, right? Because the chambers are nothing but the connected components of V minus the union of the hyperplanes. So if something is on two different sides, then it can't be in the same chamber. Okay. So this implies sort of by the usual kind of arguments that one gives when studying connectedness and so on. So you would say, for example, you would say something like, if you look at Vreg, you can split Vreg into two pieces. You take Vreg intersection, the positive half space of alpha, disjoint union Vreg intersection, the negative half space. Right? So these are now two open and closed subsets of Vreg, and x lies in one of them, y lies in the other. So you have sort of produced a separation between x and y, therefore they can't lie in the same component. They can't lie in the same chamber. But it's sort of intuitive. I mean, as soon as you run into a hyperplane, it's sort of you transition to a different chamber. Okay, so this is a key point that chambers again in some sense parameterize splittings of roots into positives and negatives. So any questions on? Okay. Okay, now sort of the next section. So once we've talked about positive roots, next notion one introduces is they called simple roots. So for this, let's assume that we have split R into plus and minus using some element of x. So okay, so before I start, I should also say here's a well, not definition, rather notation. If C is a chamber, then by R plus of C, we will mean R plus of x for any x coming from C, right? This is the splitting which is defined by any element of C. So by this I will just mean R plus of x for any x in C. And we have just seen it doesn't matter which x you pick in C as long as it's in C. So that's the notation for R plus of C. So now we want to somehow take these positive roots. So for the remaining, let's just say let's fix the chamber C. Therefore, you have this defines a splitting of the roots into positives and negatives. Now, since I fixed my C, let me just drop it and start calling it R plus and R minus with respect to this fixed choice of C. Now, let's define a notion of simple roots, which will be sort of the simplest amongst the positive roots. So the definition is, so we need a couple of definitions. So a root beta in R plus, so a positive root is set to be indecomposable, or maybe we will start with decomposable. Set to be decomposable if you can write it as a sum of two other positive roots. Okay. So, the natural intuitive meaning of the word decomposable, you can write it as a sum of two positive roots. Okay. So, as an example, if you take A11, okay. So, I guess we should have also said what the positive roots are. So, if you if you take A2, now the positive roots with respect to some choice of chamber, right, we must choose a chamber and then figure out what the positive roots are. So, let us choose chamber 1. Okay. So, as an example, if you choose chamber 1, we will just draw it again. Example, the A2 root system. Now, so the first chamber is this guy, and if you pick any x here, the positive roots by definition would be things whose inner product is positive with respect to that choice of x. So, let us pick x here and ask which of the 6 roots would make an acute angle with x, right. That is what positive inner product means. So, and observe that making an acute angle with x would, among the 6, it is only these 3 which I have sort of drawn in, in bold. So, these 3 would be the ones which make a acute angle with x. The remaining 3 would in fact be obtuse, right. This angle is already 120, for instance. So, the remaining 3 roots would make an obtuse angle with x. So, therefore, these 3 are the positive roots in this case. So, maybe we should call it alpha, beta, gamma are the positive roots. So, x belongs to chamber 1. Only these 3 guys, and minus alpha, minus beta, minus gamma in this picture would be the negative roots. And the next notion here is that of decomposability. So, observe among alpha, beta and gamma, we further have beta is, they are all of the same root length, and they make 60-degree angles with each other. So, observe beta in fact can further be written as alpha plus gamma. Right, just the parallelogram rule applied to these 3 guys. So, beta is somewhat well, it's decomposable with respect to this definition. It can be written further in terms of the positive roots. Observe alpha and gamma cannot be. They cannot be written in terms of other positives, because there are only beta and gamma are the only other choices. If you want to write alpha, you can attempt to write it as beta plus gamma, but then that's something else. Right. So, only beta admits this further splitting into positives. Alpha and gamma are not decomposable. So, that's the definition of indecomposable. So, you would say beta is indecomposable if it is not decomposable. So, in this case, this guy beta is decomposable and alpha and gamma are not decomposable or indecomposable. Okay. So, now we are ready to define the simple roots. So, here is the definition. You just collect together all the indecomposable elements. So, again remember there was a fixed choice of chamber there. So, we define the set B for basis. B of C is defined to be the set of all beta in R plus of C such that Beta is indecomposable. So in some sense, it's the most elementary elements, the atomic elements which live in R plus, and these elements, these positive roots are called the simple roots. The elements of the indecomposable roots are what are called the simple roots. Okay, so we have defined chambers, we have used them to split roots into positives and negatives, and amongst the positives we have figured out what the most elementary ones are, and they are the simple roots. So now sort of it's a main proposition which tells us, which justifies the term basis used for these. The set of simple roots is in fact a basis for the vector space. It's a basis in the usual sense of the word. It's a basis for the vector space V. Okay, so that's fact 1. The set of simple roots forms a basis. Fact 2, the set of positive roots. So every positive root can be written, of course every vector can be written as a linear combination of simple roots now, right? If you grant one, it's a basis, so every element of the vector space can be written as a linear combination of these simple roots. But further, the positive roots can be written as a positive integral linear combination or a non-negative integral linear combination of the simple roots. Okay, that's that notation there. Z greater than or equal to 0 of B of C. This means it's all linear combinations where the coefficients are non-negative integers. And of course, the obvious fact holds for the negative roots. Okay. So the positive roots are positive linear combinations of the simples, the negative roots are negative linear combination of the simples. In particular, it means there are no mixed sign roots, right? You cannot have a root which, when you write in terms of the simple roots, some of the coefficients will be positive and the others will be negative. That can never happen. They are all either positive or all all negative. Right. No, that of course is assuming one. If B of C is a basis, right? So we'll show this. If it is a basis, then every vector has an expression, right? Every vector has an expression in terms of linear combination of the basis elements. Those coefficients could of course be arbitrary real numbers. So what we are claiming in part 2 is that positive roots will have the coefficients for them will all be non-negative integers. Right? Did that answer your question? Correct. In terms of BC. So first I have to show that BC is a basis. Without that, of course, I am not guaranteed of such an expression. Okay, but let's try and prove 2 first. See, this is sort of reminiscent of many of these kinds of arguments, right? When you define what it means for something to be, to be splittable or decomposable into smaller pieces, and then you finally, once all the definitions are done, you attempt to show that everything can be written, like prime factorization and so on. You define prime as something which cannot be split any further and sort of show that everything has a factorization into primes. This is sort of something like that, right? The betas are things which cannot be split any further. They are the elements of BC, they are the indecomposables. And now you attempt to show that everything can be written in terms of the indecomposables, right? So we just follow the usual argument. So proof of 2, let's do 2 first. Let's pick a positive root and let's attempt to show that it can be written as a non-negative integer linear combination of the indecomposable positive roots. Okay, so how would one do this? How does this usual argument work? You start with the positive root beta. If it is already indecomposable, you are done. If not, it can be written as a sum of 2 positive roots, right, according to the definition of decomposability. If it's indecomposable, you are done. If it's decomposable, it can be written as a sum of beta 1 and beta 2. If they are both indecomposable, you are done. If not, each of them can be written in terms of further, and so on. You sort of push this tree as far as it goes, but you have to show that this process terminates, right? So you also need, so if when you're doing prime factorization, for instance, you take a number, you keep factoring, but at every step the number gets smaller. So you are guaranteed that at some point you will reach, something which cannot be split any further, which would actually be prime. But here you sort of need to worry about this. In all these types of proofs, you need to be, you need to worry about somehow getting the process to stop, right? And the usual thing is like in prime factorization, you attempt to construct some kind of measure of smallness, right? So this guy is big, and when I keep getting lower and lower in my tree, whatever it is, that measure that I define gets smaller and smaller, and at some point it can't get smaller than something. That's the usual argument. Okay, so that measure of smallness or bigness sort of a very useful technique in this business is sometimes called the height function. So let's just define that, which we'll use to say that this algorithm terminates. So this is the height function, the height of a root. There are many different height functions. The height is just the generic term used for any function which is used to measure, like I say, smallness. In the appropriate context, you can change this to be something else. They all have the same form. So what is the height function? You do the following. Remember, you had a choice of a chamber to start with, right? There was a chamber, and the positive roots are fellows which have finite positive inner product with every element of the chamber. So let's pick an element of a chamber. So let's fix some element, let's call it x naught, in the chamber C. And recall, this means that all the positive roots have positive inner product with x naught. Like that's if and if. That's how you define the positive roots. It is R plus of C. Right? So there is some inner product which is a positive real number. Now you just use this as your measure of smallness. So you define the height of a root. So the definition of height. Height of a root alpha is defined to be its inner product with alpha with x naught. Okay. So the height of a root by definition is its inner product with x naught. In particular, all positive roots have positive height. The height is a real number, by the way. Okay. So observe that all the positive roots have positive height. Now let's do the following. So let's and observe height is a linear function. So height of alpha plus beta is of course height of alpha plus height of beta. Okay, so what are the various properties? This is property 1, property 2, height of alpha. If alpha is a positive root, minimum over all positive roots of height of alpha is some strictly positive real number. So it's bounded below in some sense, right? This is the stopping condition of the algorithm. Yes? I pick anything in C. Yeah, exactly, yeah, like I said, height is not a universal terminology, it is just any function which will measure smallness in all these algorithms. Yeah. Here you can pick any element of C. Okay, so the point is the height of an element is bounded below. The height of a positive root is bounded below, because of course there are only finitely many positive roots. So it must be some positive number. Okay, so these are two things we will need. I mean, these are the only things we will need to show that the algorithm terminates. So let us now use this to measure smallness. So I'll go back and complete the proof. So what we do here, let's also keep track of the height of the roots. So to start with, beta has some height which we know is positive, right, because beta, remember, was a positive root. So it surely has positive height. Now when I split beta as beta 1 plus beta 2, each of these fellows is a positive root and height is additive, right. So clearly the heights of these fellows is smaller than the height of beta. So here I am already looking at height of beta I smaller than the height of the parent, and so on. Every time a node sort of splits into two, the children have smaller height than the parent, right. Now the point is this process can't keep going on and on, because at every step the height at least decreases by m, right. Observe, the minimum of the height of a positive root is some number m, right, some strictly positive number m. So it's not as if you can't do one of your epsilon by 2, epsilon by 4 kind of things which you see in analysis, because beta 1 and beta 2, they will be lower in height than beta by at least a factor of by at least m, right. They go down at least by m each time. So which means since m is a strictly positive number, if you keep going all the way down to infinity, at some point the height will become negative, right. So the height decrease is is bounded below. So therefore the height is not only is the height smaller, but most importantly it's smaller by at least m. Okay. So that's all you need to show that this algorithm terminates. Okay. So again, I guess I only said it largely in words, but you should ensure that you complete the details, because in some sense this proof, at least the basic ideas of the proof will just keep recurring in various avatars in various places. Okay. So what have we shown? We have shown that every element of R plus of C can be written in this way. So we have actually shown two, right. Every positive root can be written as a non-negative integer linear combination of the simple roots, and in fact that almost shows one. It at least says that B of C spans the space, right. Remember the root system, one of the axioms is it spans the space. So since we have shown two, it at least implies that B of C, so observe the fact that we have shown two implies that we almost shown one, but well, half of one spans V. Since of course since in fact R or R plus spans V. Okay. So all we are left with at this point is to show that B of C is linearly independent. Okay. Okay. I just have just enough time to complete the proof. So we just need to show only need linear independence. We only need to show linear independence of B of C. So for this we sort of need to make one more observation. So observe something else. That if you take any pair of roots which are in B of C, if you take two indecomposable roots, then their Cartan integer has to be less than or equal to 0. Or observe, this is just another way of saying that their inner product is less than or equal to 0. right? Because it's 2 alpha beta over beta beta. Okay, so this is sort of the maybe one should call it a lemma, and its proof is more or less already done, because if not, then we actually concluded something about alpha minus beta, right? If n alpha beta is positive, then we said alpha minus beta is a root, right? Now, if alpha minus beta is a root, then you can write, well, that sort of contradicts decomposability for alpha, because you can now write alpha as beta plus gamma, right? Did I do that right? Yeah, alpha is beta plus gamma, right? Now, of course, this would contradict decomposability provided this were a positive root, right? Because you should be able to write it as a sum of two positive roots. Then, well, that's what I will do if it's positive. Then case A, this is a positive root. Case B, it's a negative root, in which case it contradicts decomposability for beta. Okay, so if it's a positive root, alpha is a problem. If it's a negative root, beta is a problem. So in either case, it contradicts the fact that both alpha and beta were indecomposable to start with. Okay, so now the final step. So therefore, what this actually says is the set of simple roots. Precisely what we want here. So in this case, remember the simple roots that I mentioned were alpha and gamma. So this is a simple root, and this guy was a simple root. Right? These are both simple roots, and what this lemma says is that simple roots always make obtuse angles with each other. Right? In this case, these two guys make a 120-degree angle. Right? Simple roots can never make an acute angle. That's the key point. And so the final thing is, well, again, a lemma which I won't prove, just leave as exercise, but rather a very interesting fact from linear algebra in some sense. It says that if you have a set of vectors, if you have a vector space V and you have a set S of vectors is such that it satisfies two properties. Here V is an inner product space, say. So let's say I have a positive definite form. If V is an inner product space, or maybe let's just write that properly. Is an inner product space and S is a subset satisfying two properties. One, that S lies on one side of some hyperplane. So it lies in some half space, and two, elements of S are mutually obtuse. Okay. So if you have vectors which lie on the same side of some hyperplane which make mutually obtuse angles with each other, then they must be linearly independent. Then S is linearly independent. Okay, so I leave this lemma as an exercise, but observe that if you take this lemma for granted, then we are done, because the set B of C certainly satisfies this mutually obtuse property, as we see from this lemma, and it lies on one side of a hyperplane, right? Why does it lie on one side of a hyperplane? For instance, you can take an element x0 in C in the chamber, and every element of R plus lies on the positive half space of x0. Right? It makes a positive inner product with x0. So sort of by definition, it lies on one side of a hyperplane, and the mutually obtuse is the sort of harder property which we prove here. And So given these two things, it's just a general fact from linear algebra that those vectors must be linearly independent. Okay? So that completes the proof of this proposition. So we have shown 2 from which we show that it spans, and then using something more that it's in fact linearly independent. Okay, so I'll stop there.